Hello and welcome to MalMakes. Today we're doing a painting based on the Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. This is the full version. If you're interested in the time-lapse, you can click on the card here. Otherwise, let's get started. For the autumn season, I wanted to paint something autumn-themed, and I especially love fall colors and the reds, yellows, and oranges you get on the leaves in the fall. Where I live, we really don't get that many fall colors. Things turn like sort of yellowish brown and then just solid brown. So I don't really get that nice vivid look, and I thought about different games and different parts of games where you get those fall colors, and the Akkala region from Breath of the Wild really stood out to me. Especially the Great Fairy Fountain where it's the pod before it opens up. I thought that would be really cool. So I loaded up Breath of the Wild, spent a lot of time there trying to figure out what time of day and what type of weather would really make that area come to life the best. And I discovered that golden hour was perfect. It's the hour right before sunset where everything gets tinged with a yellow hue, so all of those fall warm colors really come to life. And I looked at different angles and I really liked the mushrooms behind the pod and in the front of the pod, so I really wanted to make sure I got all of that together in the piece. So I've pushed some things around here just to make sure that it got exactly how I wanted. And this is the basic composition for how I'm going to do that, and because it is golden hour, I get a lot of green in the sky instead of so much blue. So I'm going to keep pushing that golden hour where everything is tinged with that gold look. So everything will be very warm instead of cool, except maybe in some of these deepest shadows over here. The first thing I need to do is figure out kind of where this horizon line is and where the sky is going to go, so I can fill that gradient in. Now, I didn't draw in or fill in any clouds here, and I don't want there to be a whole lot, but there should be just a hint of them, so it's not just a solid gradient up there and kind of plain. So as I paint, I'll just streak some white paint through this and blend it in a little bit, so there's just a hint of lighter colors where clouds would be. I realized in editing this video that I didn't talk a whole lot. I guess I'm just distracted with some stuff going on in my personal life, and I was focused on getting the painting done, so I decided to do a voiceover. After I finished the background, the horizon, the clouds, I started to work on the mountains. I drew them in first, and the one that's further away I blocked in with a solid light blue, and the closer one with a dark blue, because it's a little more in silhouette with the sun being over on the left. I also added in a little variance in the blues, just so they weren't solid flat blue. There's an indication that there's something else going on other than just this solid color being back there. With all of the faraway background details done, I started to go into the midground, drawing in the grassy hillside, these rocks that sit in the background. I blocked them in with some dark brown, and used a palette knife to swipe in the lighter burnt umbers and burnt siennas I used for their highlights. For the grass, I drew in where all of the shadows from the trees were going to be, and blocked it in a light green and a dark blue-green for the shadows. And then I went back and forth with those colors, trying to play up the variation so it wasn't just a solid color there on the canvas. I also used a comb brush, which has very few bristles on it, and brushed in some lighter greens on the highlight areas, just so there was that grass texture, and I think it turned out really well. And once I was happy with all of that grass, I could go into adding some foliage or flowers on the hillside, tapping in some oranges and yellows just to make it have some life and start to bring in those fall colors, which later I bring them down into the water, and I think the effect worked really well. And eventually I got sick of looking at this blank canvas here on the bottom, so I thought I would try painting the water just to see what happened, and I didn't like it. It was way too saturated, so later I do repaint the water, but at least it was nice to not look at blank canvas when I was working on everything else. Something I've noticed about the way I paint trees is I was filling in too many leaves. I lose the bright, airy openness of them, and I put too many leaves in the space with my paintbrush, and it gets a little bit muddled, and I want to keep those bright open areas like this right here. So I wanted to do it a little bit differently this time. I started by painting in some areas where I want tree branches to show through, drawing in a little bit of an outline where I want leaves to go so I know about how big that space is going to be contained in that area. And then I picked a mid color for each of the trees. So for all of the red, orange trees, I mixed up a burnt rusty color, and I filled in splotches where I want there to be a ton of leaves, where there's a lot of leaves in that area where you wouldn't see through the tree. So I have a couple of those with this tree you can kind of see in here. I just put the paint on the canvas in these bubbles, didn't think too much about it, mixed up a darker color, the darkest color for the leaf, and then I painted some splotches on top of those circles so it had a little bit of variety and it wasn't just a flat color there. Then I took that same dark color with my fan brush and I tapped in some leaves, making sure I left a few different open areas to make the tree look open and bright and airy. Then I mixed up a lighter color and tapped in that tree. So this is at stage 2, this big one over here. These red ones, these little red ones over here, those are all at stage 3, where I mixed up a lighter color and tapped that in on top. And then I can mix up a super saturated or lighter version of that color and tap in the brightest highlights. The red ones down here don't have that yet, but the green one does. So there's a little bit of lighter color here and then just on the edges of the tree, just to give it a little bit of shape. So the green one, besides painting and details for the tree trunk, are the only ones that are done here on the canvas. All of these little red ones need that same highlight, bright, saturated color to bring them to life. And then I have to go back and start doing some of the yellow ones, and then the ones that sit on the very top, because those ones I need to make sure that I paint the leaves on top of the things behind it. So I'm leaving those ones alone for now while I do all of the background ones. And the last thing I have to block in is the seed pod itself. I started by drawing it a bit more bulbous at the bottom, and I didn't like how it looked. It was more like a Hershey Kiss. So I started bringing in the sides and made it rounder, and that definitely helped the shape of it. I blocked it in with a solid green and used a blue-green for the shadows where all of the lines were, and eventually I started to add more details, bringing in brighter yellows for the highlights, and I think the shape of it and the luminosity of the paint really worked well. For the top, I used the same oranges as I had on the orange trees, bringing in some browns for their shadows, and just tried to vary up the way the directions of all of those went, kind of like the tops of corn tassels. The other thing I struggled with was trying to get these spikes in the water right. They hold the seed pod kind of, or protect it in a way, so trying to get that ellipse right for the same way the seed pod sits in the water was a little frustrating. But eventually I got those, and I just left them in chalk, but later I do obviously paint them in. And the other thing that I was frustrated with were these spikes on the seed pod. Some of them I thought looked perfect. They really looked like they were attached, and they matched the ones next to them, so they look like they actually wrap around the seed pod. But some of them didn't, and later I do fix them, but they were frustrating me at the time. While some things were drying, I got frustrated of looking at this water because I didn't like it still. Obviously I hadn't touched it yet, but I took a paint marker and started to block in some foliage, and I really liked how it looked. I liked how much there was, and I thought it would be nice to continue filling it in, but first I would have to fix that water. The seed pod color didn't always feel right, so once I started to add some yellow to the highlight area, it really helped bring that together and look like part of the rest of the painting. For the water, I tried to bring colors that were slightly more muted, less pastel, and that really helped, darkening the areas in shadow, lightening the areas in highlights, and then trying to do a little bit of a wash of the reflected colors. The seed pod was a lot of fun to paint. The spikes were a little bit frustrating because they wrap this way around it, where we kind of go like with a clock, but they also wrap this way around it. And that part was the hard part. And I think some of them, like the top ones here and then some of these bottom ones, turned out really good and have that where they should be with the foreshortening. These two I'm not super happy with, but I can leave them alone for now and always repaint them later. So I've kind of drawn where I want them to be, where they should be, and I'm gonna leave that there because I can keep an eye on them as I'm filling everything in and decide if it needs to be done. The last thing I have to do is all of the water and the foreground stuff here, and there is a lot of foliage in this water. I started by doing the water first as a base and trying to keep dark areas to fill in some plants in those spaces, and light areas where there's going to be less foliage and flowers and stuff. So when I'm doing this, I want the reflected light from the trees, so I have the yellow right here, I have the orange and red kind of here under these mushrooms. The rocks reflect a little bit back over here, but then it gets to a cool shadow side for the water over here on the right, because my sun is like upper left. And fading from those cool colors into these warmer tones was frustrating because I kept getting too much green. And there's a little bit of green left in the painting, which is fine because this would reflect some green down, but I didn't want all of it to be green, which is what happens when you use blue and yellow. So I think transitioning between some of these spaces down here worked out really well, and I really liked the texture and the look of the water. It's not this clear, soft water that it is in game where you can see like straight down to the bottom, but it looks more like water to me, for a painting at least, and I'm happy with that. So I'm finishing up by doing the numerous plants and stuff here in the water. There's some spikes that sit around the base of the seed pod, the mushrooms that cascade up to it where you would walk up, and then I have the millions of plants that are down here. So once I finish these mushrooms, I'm just working my way into orange and oranger colors as I fill them in to look like these same spikes here. I can start to work on all of those plants. A little bit ago in the painting, I had like a paint marker drawing in a bunch of the plants, just very roughly sketched in. I'll probably go back to doing that with chalk, and then to the paint marker, and then starting to work the greens for the greenery, and then flowers with yellow and red and whatever color they are here on top of all of that. And that's just going to take a while to fill in all these tiny little details to really make this space complete, because otherwise it's just this little pond here. Those flowers really make everything come together, so there's going to be a lot to do. So I'm just redrawing in all of the water foliage and trying to keep in mind how I had it drawn before because I liked the layout of everything. Maybe adding in a few more here and there, but once I was done with that, I took that paint marker again and just went back over those chalk lines because I liked how they looked. Then to block those in, I used a base green for all of the greenery for all of these plants. With some of them I went a bit more yellow as I filled in their highlights and their general colors, and some I went a bit more blue just so they would vary up between the different plants. But filling them in with a base green first really helped kind of fill them in so it didn't feel like such a chore to fill in all of these plants, because trust me, there were a lot of them. I also felt like the mushrooms were floating a little bit, so I added just a slight shadow underneath them to really help cement them into the piece. And I also filled in 2 fairies. I wanted them to be tiny and slightly hidden in the painting, but I definitely wanted those to be there. And to finish this foliage over here, I just brought the same colors from the hillside down into the water to help connect those pieces together. I finished up all of the foliage in the foreground. Originally I had painted it and it was quite blue. It didn't feel like it matched the rest of the painting, almost like it was from somewhere else. And in order to make it look cohesive with everything else, I had to bring some warm colors to it because it was too blue. And that's fine for areas that are in shadow like these ones over here, but the stuff that sits here in the foreground that's directly in the sun needed to have that warm colors, just like the warm yellow-green I get on the front of the seed pod. So I took some yellow-green and brought it into the ferns, and I think it really helped bring all of that together. And then I started the arduous task of adding in all of the flowers and bright colors in the water. I started over here with the amaranth, and I really loved this purple. It looked really good with everything else on the painting, so I brought the 2 amaranths in here, and then I started to add a little bit more violet into the rest of the painting because I thought it worked really well with my color scheme. I took some of the colors I had from the flowers on the hillside and brought them down into the water here for these nondescript flowers in the background. And then these flowers here in the foreground are daisies or black-eyed Susans or poppies or something. So I took the same colors I had from my fall foliage back there and started to tap in some petals, bringing some centers to them so some of them face the camera and some of them like are tilted away. And I really like how they turned out. They start a bit brighter here in the sun and they're a bit more muted and dull over in this way, and I think that worked really well. And the last thing I did to bring this together and make this a bit more magical was add in the 2 fairies that I wanted to have there. So it has this little bit of area of attraction where you look and you're like, oh, there's a fairy there. And then you continue to kind of look at the rest of the piece, and I think that really helped. But I really like this painting because it has this encompassed effect with this tree here and this yellow tree over here. Everything is contained in the canvas on this little grove, and I think it's kind of like a special little window into the world. So I'm super happy with how this turned out. I'm going to add a little bit more highlights in some areas, I think, like on the mushrooms, maybe some of these peaks here, especially on the ones that you kind of get lost in the background, just to finish this up, and then I'll be all done. And we're done! We have the Akkala Great Fairy Fountain from The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. If you're interested in this piece, you could buy a poster or a phone case, or bid on this original canvas. There's links down below. Also, consider supporting me on Patreon. You can find out more at supportmal.com. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes of MalMakes, and I'll see you again here for another video game painting.